Ralph Ghoche is an assistant professor of architecture at Barnard College. He's a historian of 19th century architecture and urbanism, and currently doing research on the territorial interventions of the Catholic Church in colonial Algeria in the 19th century. He's also written widely on French architecture and its relationship to theories of ornament, archaeology, and aesthetics in the 19th century. And among his teaching interests, he's taught courses on landscape theory and ecology, utopian urbanism, and architecture and the biological metaphor. So we're hoping there might be some interesting intersections between those teaching interests and some of what we've seen in the film tonight. And we also have Jeffrey Potent, who's an adjunct professor at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. He's developed and has been teaching a graduate course on corporate sustainability at CIPA and is developing a new course on agriculture, energy, and environmental policy. Jeff has also taught courses in systems theory, natural capital valuation, and sustainable agriculture at the Columbia Earth Institute. He serves on the faculty steering committee for the Columbia Climate School, Healthy and Sustainable Food Systems Network, and co-leads its local food systems research hub. He also co-chairs a seminar series on sustainable finance and serves on the board of several nonprofit organizations and is very involved with farming initiatives in the Catskill region. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us this evening. As I mentioned in the introduction, all three of us really are also discovering Pierre Rabhi along with you. So we're not pretending to be experts on his life or his thinking, but from each of our perspectives, just wanted to share some thoughts with you about the film and what we learned about his life and works. So I thought maybe I would start with you, Ralph, and you've worked on the intersection between Algeria and France, and particularly colonial Algeria. And Pierre Rabhi's life is very interesting. He's born in 1938 in a small village. His father is a blacksmith who ends up, like most of the men in the village, working in a coal mine when coal is discovered in the area. And that was really a moment of real transformation of the economy in that area. And then his mother dies, as we learned in the film, at age 5. He's raised by a French family, moves to France in his 20s. And so what are your thoughts about how you see his identity, his kind of hybrid identity as both someone of Algerian origin, but who grows up and lives his life out in France? Would you like to share some thoughts with us about that question?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's interesting. He barely ever mentions Algeria, and when he mentions it, he mentions really only the very specific surrounding out of which he grew up. You know, he mentions his father, as you said, a blacksmith. He mentions at times the family that adopted him, but barely speaks about the kind of colonial context that, you know, was, I mean, just such a heavy weight on all Algerians around the time. So he's born in 1938. That's, you know, 108 years after the conquest of Algeria by France. Tremendous upheaval, particularly in farming and in land tenure, land ownership, and that must have weighed on him. You know, Algeria was mostly, I mean, it had all sorts of land uses. There were farmers who had kind of private ownership of land when the French arrived, but there were also, and this is the largest share of the land, was used by nomadic tribes who essentially moved in the winter months to the south, and moved to the kind of plains for pasture for their sheep and goats, etc. In the summer. And so land tenure was very, very kind of complicated question. And the French, when they arrived, they essentially disregard the very complicated land ownership rights and usage rights, and essentially start to privatize the land. They essentially don't recognize the idea that land can be owned collectively, and if you don't have a title, essentially it can be appropriated by the government, and in many cases given up to French settlers who arrive newly on Algerian land and are given particular plots. And so there's a kind of great upheaval by the colonial rule, and he is very quickly, so in 1938 he's born. Soon after, really 4 years later, he's placed in a family who are French, in fact, involved in this little oasis town. The adoptive father is a mining engineer for essentially the same mine that Rabhi's biological father will be essentially have no other choice but to be employed in this mine because he cannot make a living with his blacksmith trade. And so very quickly, Rabhi starts to occupy and negotiate between these two worlds, the world of the colonizer and the world of the colonized. And so it's very interesting to see just how he negotiates that. So even though he's adopted into this new family, he spends quite a bit of time with his biological family. And you see already in his autobiography the kind of key fault lines, or the key kind of elements of his identity develop. He talks a great deal about his grandmother, who this is his biological grandmother, who's very, very critical of modernity, modern technology, industry, probably for good reason. She's seen how her oasis town has been transformed into a zone of extraction for coal, and starts to connect modernity and industry with colonial occupation. And then the adoptive family, who are Catholic, have all sorts of, he talks a lot about how clean everything is in the adoptive world. He's, always showering, surfaces are always cleaned, etc. And so for a while, he's kind of negotiating between these two worlds, going to Quranic school on Friday, but going to Catholic school during the rest of the week. And eventually he makes this pivot towards this new direction, towards the colonial world, and converts officially to Catholicism, changes his name from Rabhi to Pierre Rabhi. And then, essentially becomes much more fully immersed in the French world, and of course doesn't look very French, looks very Algerian. And so there are a number of mentions where he both identifies with the French world, but always reminded that he is not quite French. And in a way, today it's something that so many people living in France are experiences, this kind of the contradictions and difficulties of this hybrid identity that they have to constantly negotiate.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just a follow-up question, and then I'll turn over to Jeff. But so he, politically, it's very interesting because he is in Algeria in the 1950s when the Algerian War of Independence is going on. That's when he leaves to go to France. But there's one quote in his biography, and it also comes up elsewhere, where he describes himself holding a flag and saying Algérie française, because he's he's being raised by this French family, and so has a complicated relationship with that War of Independence going on. And then I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how perhaps the experience of that coal being discovered and the mine being set up in the course of his childhood, and he really sees this transformation happening with his father, and talks a lot about his father's relationship with blacksmithing craft, and describes the life, what life is like for the men who find themselves having to work for the mine because the whole economy is turned upside down by this. And that becomes the foundation for a critique of modernity. It's really based on initially on his observations of that process happening in his town. And yet he doesn't talk about colonization or the history of colonialism. So could you say a little bit more about your reading of that political position, or in which he criticizes modernity but doesn't talk about colonialism?
Yeah, I mean, it's strange, in preparing for this conversation today, I looked up, Google, tried to find instances where Rabhi and colonialism are discussed together, and I found nothing truly. And in all the interviews I've read of him, he never actually, he talks about modernity. So it seems like a little bit like his grandmother, modernity is colonialism. And so he takes the colonial part for granted. But it's interesting, this kind of extractive, I think the term today often uses this kind of mindset of extractivism that is very clear in the way that he depicts that early moment in his life as a negative force, which leads his father essentially to give up his trade. Algeria is very rich in many minerals. The French actually, very early on in the conquest, in order to, it's a long story, but there are a lot of quarrels as to whether to continue the colonization project in Algeria in the first years. And one of the key figures who makes one of the key arguments that will keep the colonization project intact is Henri Fournel, who will essentially prove or try to show that Algeria, against assumptions, is actually very minerally rich. So just like agriculture will be one of the key areas that the French will get very excited about the riches of after all, North Africa and Algeria in particular was called the breadbasket of Rome. It was Algerian wheat that helped feed the French revolutionaries during the famines soon after the French Revolution, that helped feed Napoleon's army when it attempted to conquer. It was a debt actually unpaid by the French to the Algerians, who sent them all this wheat, which actually sparked the conquest of Algeria, because the French refused to pay and were then offended that the Ottoman Dey of Algiers was upset, and then essentially put a blockade and conquered Algeria. But all this to say, all these things, are very much in the kind of background. But the fact that he doesn't mention them is fairly odd, and it is. And I think it's part of this kind of universalizing of the problem that I think he often tends to do. He picks his fight very cleverly, and has a kind of unifying humanitarian angle, and I think he's very much against. He speaks in generalities and doesn't want to get embroiled in the very tense and difficult question of Algeria and colonialism.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, he ends up sort of stepping into the role of the wise old peasant, who comes out of an age-old tradition of way of relating to the land. And so it's interesting that he takes up that mantle. And the fact that he's Algerian doesn't really seem to enter into the picture or into how he presents his experience. But that it's there because
it's there because
right.
You almost feel like he's this figure that he's the French peasant, but he could also be the Algerian peasant who had all sorts of tactics for maintaining the fertility of the land, such as burning. Actually, all these things were made illegal by the French, or very early on, burning of the land in order to bring nutrition, so that, you know. But he's almost a kind of universalist figure of the peasant, and could, in a way, be grounded multiple parts of the world. Yeah.
So Jeff, turning to you, maybe I'll just start with just two questions. One, a sort of overall question of what are some of your reactions to seeing this film and to learning about Pierre Rabhi? What is it that struck you coming from the angle that you're coming from? And then maybe you can also help us understand a little bit better what exactly is agroecology, and is that the same as permaculture or as organic farming? What is it that he's doing that that's particular, and how does that fit into your understanding of a larger history of the sustainable agriculture movement or regenerative food systems movement? So first, sort of general reactions, and then helping us understand a little bit and situate his work.
Thank you. Looking at his background, having a connection to tribal North African culture, and then experiencing the radical transition that took place in his country, which is not so dissimilar from the radical transition that has taken place and is still taking place in many areas that are developing, and is even taking place in rural communities here in the United States as we sit here and speak today. Those two experiences very clearly shows how he was drawn to agroecology, toward an agricultural system that is respective of the planet, respective of natural systems. So it's not surprising, but he was at this in the early 1960s. And granted, there were people farming organically. Well, first of all, organic farming predates modern agriculture, but a reaction to modern agriculture through something that is akin to what we call organic or agroecology today, agroecological farming systems today, was experimented with by many people as the agro-industrial revolution was taking place. There was an organic farm operating on Staten Island in the 1920s, run by people who were reacting to use of pesticides. So he wasn't alone, but certainly in the early 1960s, he was a rare beast. And the fact that he was not only practicing agroecology on the land, but beginning to see the philosophical, the spiritual connections, and then being drawn to write and communicate and engage and educate is really what makes him unique. Today, well, even then there were others emerging, and today there are many people, even here in the United States, who are walking a similar path. Granted, they probably had very different backgrounds, but people who saw the damage that was being done through industrial agriculture, and looking for alternative paths. There are many terms that are being used, and sometimes interchangeably. I'll throw a bunch of them at you. There's agroecology, there's regenerative agriculture, there's organic agriculture, there's climate smart agriculture. I'm only scratching the surface. All of these are either terms used interchangeably by people who don't fully understand them, or when they're used correctly, they still all draw from the same root, which is basically agriculture that grows out of an understanding of natural systems, an observation of natural systems, an attempt to emulate natural systems to achieve crop yield or animal production. In the United States, there's several innovative organizations, many actually. One, the Savory Institute, focuses on something called holistic management, which is a grazing system for animals that rotates animals on many different fields. And the idea was inspired also by another African who saw the natural grazing and natural habit migration patterns of animals and attempted to emulate that, or actually did emulate that in farming systems. There is another organization that's looking at perennial or experimenting with perennial grains as opposed to annual grains, which have a lot of damage associated with their production. Those are just a couple of examples, but there are many innovations going on right now, all sort of growing out of that same realization that something is wrong with our industrial system and it has to change. Now, there's a lot of debate about can these small scale experimental type systems feed the world? I had a friend who is has a PhD in sustainable agriculture from Cornell, and her husband run an organic animal farm in the Catskills. And she came to speak to my class and gave a wonderful presentation, very similar to what we heard today about earth-based, natural system-based farming. And that evening, I received a very hostile email from one of my students who was shocked. And she said, "How can this woman come and speak to your class? She's not going to be able to feed the world with her little farm." And it shocked me until I realized there was something very familiar with this language in her email. And I realized it came right out of the marketing language of the US Farm Bureau. And then I remembered that at the beginning of the semester, she told me that her father was a corn and soybean farmer in Iowa, large-scale industrial agriculture. And clearly there is major friction between these alternative approaches and conventional agriculture. In fact, hostility more than just friction in many cases. People who just don't want to accept that more gentle systems can actually produce a fair amount of yield and even competitive yield with industrial systems. Now there's experimentation. There's an organization in Pennsylvania called the Rodale Institute that has 40 years of organic trials where they compared head-to-head organic versus conventional or industrial system production. And they found that not only were the yields roughly the same, but actually under stress conditions, drought or floods, the organic fields did better than the chemical fields, chemically induced agricultural fields. So what he was an early pioneer in is now catching a lot of momentum. And in fact, while there's still a lot of hostility between the industrial agriculture world and the alternatives, the full array of alternatives I've just mentioned, there's actually a lot of softening of those lines. I did some work with some very large agro-industrial companies who were doing some very innovative land management practices. Maybe their animal welfare systems left much to be desired, but at least they were experimenting with some alternatives. I was friendly with a fellow who was the head of the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the element of the US Department of Agriculture that's responsible for soil and water conservation, but very conventional organization. And I mentioned him the rotational grazing system that Richard Savory developed, and I expected this guy to be very hostile. And he said, "No, as a matter of fact, on my ranch, we've been experimenting with it, and we've been improving our stocking rates, we've improved the biodiversity of our soil. And when there's a drought, our pastures are green, whereas our neighbors' pastures are brown." So the lines are breaking down a bit. So indeed, Mr. Rabhi was a trendsetter, but the trend is catching momentum.
Thank you so much. And there was a back to the land, return to the land movement in France, as there was here in the late '60s. But he was on the early edge of that trend.
Yeah, actually, if I may speak to that before you go on, because that's an interesting point. Today, there are many innovative people doing work in this area, and I'm so often presented with the contrast that the folks who are doing regenerative agriculture systems today are not the same as the people in the 60s and 70s, the back to the land folks, people my generation, who are rejecting and going out into the woods and trying to farm, often without skills and experience. What's unique about Mr. Rabhi was that he was part of that early movement, but he very much understood that we needed to find a balance between science and tradition. And in a lot of his writing, he talks about trying to find that balance, trying to embrace the science where it makes sense, what the Western world is bringing to agriculture where it makes sense, but also but staying true to an understanding about natural systems and that we're all connected to the natural world, and everything in agriculture has to grow out of an observation of the way natural systems function and working with those natural processes to achieve yield.
I'm going to ask each of you one more question, and then we're going to have some time for your comments or questions or responses to the film. There's a microphone over here, so be thinking about what you might want to say if you'd like to add something. So a follow-up question for you, Jeff. You mentioned a philosophical or spiritual sort of framework for thinkers like Rabhi, and it's true that he's an agroecologist. He's a pioneer in that field. but he also is a writer and a thinker and a sort of self-made philosopher. And he, in his writing, develops a whole philosophy of life and a critique of the capitalist system. He's a critique of the excesses of modernity, of consumerism, of the idea of infinite growth. He advocates for something he calls la sobriété heureuse, a kind of happy sobriety, though we associate that word with not drinking alcohol in this country, but meaning living a life that's more simple, a life of moderation, a life that's not based on materialism and consumerism, a life that's based on having a more healthy relationship with the natural world and an appreciation of the natural world and our place within it. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit on that, on what you see as his sort of life philosophy and how that fits into this movement, and whether you see connections between some of his ideas and some of what you know about sustainable agriculture and food systems, regenerative food systems in the United States.
Thank you. Yeah, I think all that I said before was under the heading of we all have to get along, we all have to learn how to work together. But putting that aside, there is a strong underpinning that's held by Mr. Rabhi and many of us who are involved in this field, and that is that our connection to the earth is really what inspires us to want to be involved in agriculture. Not just that we want to feed people, yes, that's critically important, but that we want to touch the earth. We want to be part of natural systems, that is really what grounds us, what returns us to the essence of life. And so many people that I know and that I work with in the Catskill Mountains who have come to the land, people who may have either grown up in family farms and went off to work in cities and got professional degrees and then came back, or newcomers who are coming to work on the land, who are approaching this from a regenerative systems approach, are doing this because they're drawn to it by their hearts. They're drawn to it because they need to be part of the land. I need to be part of land. I need to be in the Catskills, but I need to be among the trees. I need to be among growing things. And I think that is what's inspiring a lot of this movement. And what's wonderful now is that when we go there, driven by spirit and driven by heart, we're going there with skills and knowledge and a commitment to bring productivity. So we're really getting to the best of both worlds, where we're providing something desperately needed by people, good, wholesome food, and we're doing this in a way that's self-enriching, that's making our lives better because we're connected to the land, we're connected to the animals, we're connected to our neighbors, and it's an exciting, hopeful trend.
Thank you so much. If you have a question or comment, please step up to the microphone over here. A last question for Ralph. When we decided to show this film, we realized that Pierre Rabhi was not a saint, and actually there was some controversy around him, around a number of questions, including some accusations that he was homophobic, that he was misogynistic. So I thought we should just talk a little bit about that. You read a little bit about some of the comments that he made and how those were interpreted, but also tried to get a sense of what the larger context was for those comments. And so can you just share with us some thoughts about what some of those comments that you found and how you would understand them?
Yeah, I mean, I found them quite late in the game, and I'd already put some time and investment in learning about Pierre Rabhi. But I mean, essentially, he made comments in 2018 in an interview about, so they were partly taken out of context. And the way when taken out of context, it sounded like he was very much against homosexual unions. And yet, I guess in reading more about it, the larger story appeared, and was about his disagreement with essentially artificial insemination,
IVF,
yeah,
in vitro fertilization, yeah.
But being used by gay couples, by homosexuals. So nonetheless disturbing, given that he seemed to single those people out, well, not necessarily speaking about that practice for heterosexual couples. There's also comments made about essentially essentializing the kind of role that women versus men play in society and the role they ought to play in society, that, to be honest, they're hard to reckon with, but at the same time, I guess I was not all that surprised, because there is a kind of process of essentializing. There's a process of, in his thinking, from what I've read of him, he seems to, at times, draw conclusions from the natural world and transfer them to social, cultural world, which is always a very difficult prospect. Probably the best example is Herbert Spencer's definition, kind of take on Darwin, that essentially all life is a survival of the fittest, right? And we've seen that drawn from kind of scientific understanding of evolutionary development and brought into the social sphere, essentially as a kind of capitalist apologetic. So these things are always disturbing, but they're also kind of well rooted in some of the kind of intellectual framework that helped shape Rabhi's thinking. I'm thinking, for example, of a book by Fairfield Osborne that he actually mentions as the first book on ecology that he read. It's a book from 1948 called Our Plundered Earth, and it's a very influential book. It was really the first book to use those kinds of really dramatic denunciatory prose in defense of the environment. It had a big impact on people like Rachel Carson, but at the same time, it makes that same transference from the natural sphere to the social sphere, often, unfairly blaming people from third world for overpopulation, et cetera. So it's a kind of long problem, I think, in certain sectors of the environmental movements. And while sad to see it reappear in Rabhi, it's something I think a lot of environmentalists, I think we've moved past that problematic period of, blaming certain people for population over, growth and not understanding things in a larger context. There is a somewhat, dubious trajectory in some of the environmental movement.
Okay, thank you very much. There would be a lot more to say about that. We can come back to it if there's time, but I want to give you a chance to either ask a question or share a comment. Is the green light on?
Not on this microphone. I think I can just talk, right?
Well, if we'll hear you better if you. Claire is coming to help. Yeah, here you go. Lending you a.
Hey, so thank you so much for the screening and for your comments. What an amazing person and story. That was really pretty inspirational. So near the end of the movie, there was another man there speaking a little bit about utopia and about utopian societies. And so given that one of Rabhi's core concerns seemed to be replicability, right? And autonomy without autarky and the spreading of these ideas to as many sort of sustainable places as possible, sustainable not just in the environmental sense, but in the long-term economic sense as well. I'm curious, given that most of the stories we hear about intentional communities or utopian communities end in failure, right? And the only exceptions I can think of are, I grew up in the Hudson Valley, so the Bruderhof are an exception to that rule, I think. Also, a little further away, the Amish in Pennsylvania, kibbutzes in Israel. But those exceptions seem to be largely religiously motivated. So I'm curious about the potential for the sustenance of this kind of intentional and sustainable community in the absence of, or I guess in partnership with, that sort of religious unity or framework that seems to guide the most long-lived ones.
That's a great question, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to answer it. But let me just, by way of getting towards an answer, just suggest a film that we talked about today that's by Cyril Dion called Tomorrow. I don't know if you're familiar with that film. He's a French filmmaker, and Tomorrow was made in 2015, and it's available on, I think, on Amazon Prime, and it's also available through Clio, right? Yeah. Yeah. And so what in this film, what he does is look at lots of different kinds of things that are going on all over the world in different areas, from agriculture to local communities that are circulating a local currency, to cities like Copenhagen that are really taking a leadership role in terms of moving towards carbon neutrality, and looks at lots of different experiments of all kinds that are happening across the world and that are very successful. And they're not small scale efforts by a small religious community that doesn't last over time. So I think actually there are lots of things going on all over the place that are showing successful examples of a different way of organizing ourselves. So that's really encouraging. I would recommend that. And Jeff, maybe you can answer more fully the question about whether these kinds of experiments are sustainable in the longer run.
Yeah, I'll come at this from a rather backdoor perspective. I think we have a rather skewed view of what capitalism is in this country. We think Amazon is capitalism. We think a United Healthcare that provides healthcare services for 10 million people as capitalism. Actually, I was reading an article recently that said that those types of business structures are more akin to what Karl Marx had in mind than what some of the early capitalists have in mind. And I'm mentioning that, it sounds like an absurd point of entree here in response to your question, but I think the answer to success is small-scale capitalism. We're seeing this in the Catskills. We're seeing this in so many other areas around this country and around the world where small producers are working together to build a local food system. And there are people who are coming to those communities or in those communities who are buying these products because they realize that there is so many product attributes that those products are providing that they're willing to go out of their way to buy them. If they can afford it, they're willing to pay a bit more because they know they're getting something special. They know they're getting something that doesn't just feed them, but also feeds their community. So I think that's where we're seeing the success story, not necessarily in terms of intentional communities or co-ops, but there are some, by the way, amazingly successful co-ops. But I think what we're seeing is the opportunity comes in a small scale community/economy where the producers of agricultural products are producing an amazing array of product attributes, and people are buying those products and engaging with those producers, not just as customer, but as partner. And I'll just give you a quick list of some of the attributes. When I go to the Round Barn, which is our local farmers market up in the Catskills on a Saturday and go shopping, and I pick up a head of lettuce, I'm not just buying something that's a head of lettuce that looks like the head of lettuce that I could get in the supermarket. I'm getting a head of lettuce that's loaded with nutrition. I'm getting a head of lettuce that was produced in a way that doesn't deplete the soil, doesn't pollute the water, that provides economic well-being for a private company, an individual running a company, not an Amazon. Hopefully, and in many cases, I know for a fact that when they employ people, they're paying people a living wage. So that's the kind of success story that's starting to replicate. And I think that's where we can see something very hopeful. And my wife is sitting in the audience, so I better make sure I mention that the co-op models are very powerful too. There's the Park Slope Food Co-op, which I think is the largest co-op in the United States, and they buy local food, they support local agriculture. They're actually now supporting a developer who's trying to develop a 10-farm production, regenerative farming production system that's going to support really high quality food production in our region. So I'm hopeful about that type of model.
Ralph, would you like to add anything to that?
I don't know if I have much to add. I mean, kind of intentional communities often will really need to police the boundaries of their community. And I think we're in a wholly new world where boundaries are just not as as they're much more permeable. And so, yeah, I think, I think there are many things people might share, but also many things that might divide people. And I think we have actually the ability today to group up around certain goals and ideals without necessarily delivering our entire lives to a community. But yeah, I think it's a difficult problem that somehow seems like a thing that we've kind of moved from those ideals of leaving the world as we know it and building our future in a closed, isolated community, I feel.
I just wanted to add one more note about the idea of small-scale farms. One of the towns that's profiled in this film Tomorrow is Detroit, where there are apparently 1,400 organic farms that have sprung up in the city and surrounding areas. So there's this whole movement of urban farms, many of them organic, and a lot of them also have a social mission. So they're a kind of form of social enterprise. And I also wondered, maybe Jeff, you could tell us just in closing a little bit about the transition town movement, because we've been focusing on talking about agriculture and regenerative food systems here, but there's also a larger question of how communities can evolve to prepare for what's coming with climate change, and also to be more sustainable in broader ways economically beyond just agriculture. And so eco villages are intentionally created villages that are sort of artificial to begin with, but transition towns are towns that are taking existing towns and working with them in certain ways. So Jeff's been involved with that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the transition town movement.
Yeah, to some extent I can. We didn't talk that much about permaculture as a defined subcategory in this broad area, but permaculture systems are systems that are very much based on observing natural patterns of a particular area and building agriculture based on that. And there's been a very strong permaculture movement since the 1970s, created by two Australians, David Holmgren and I've forgotten the name of the guy, I apologize. Oh, Bill Mollison. And they've developed actually a training framework, which is also spread around the world. I took part in it. We do a 2-week intensive training to learn about permaculture. And one of the things you have to do as part of these permaculture design courses is actually design a permaculture farm or a permaculture business of some sort. It doesn't necessarily have to be an agriculture business, but a business that's built upon understanding natural systems and incorporating a business model into natural systems. So there was a fellow by the name of Rob Hopkins who took a 2-week permaculture design course in the UK, probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer now. And he decided to do a project on not a permaculture-based farm, but a permaculture-based community. And he looked at his town in England, a small rural town, and he decided to figure out how to use natural systems to build a community that is designed for what he called energy descent. In other words, planning for the time when we don't have so much fossil fuel available and we need to depend on renewables and we need to depend on local agriculture. And the concept that he developed for his community, for an existing community, not a new intentional community, but an existing community, was the precursor of the transition town movement. And now that model has been replicated in probably well over 1,000 communities around the world, mostly in the English and French speaking world, but it's catching on also in Latin America now as well. But again, the concept is looking at your community, looking at the assets of your community, looking at the natural relationships that your community has with its natural environment, and then building a regenerative economy around that. And we have one in the Catskills, and it's called Transition Catskills.